They say you never truly know a person until they're gone. And maybe that's even more true for the people you share blood with, but Haven and Oppos. T spoken to in a decade, because when my uncle Silas passed away, all I felt was this hollow, distant sort of ache for a man who had become a ghost long before he actually died. He was my father's older brother, the kind of guy who lived in the margins of life, a hermit in a flannel shirt who preferred the company of oak trees and coyotes to the noise of the city, and I just figured he'd leave behind a cluttered house and a few dusty memories. But then the envelope arrived. It was heavy, the kind of cream-colored stationery that feels like a threat before you even open it, and inside was a deed for 1,500 acres of raw, untouched wilderness and a handwritten note that just said, "They're coming for the dirt, Elias. Don and Oppos, T let in Oppos, and move the stones." I didn't in Oppos, T know who in quote. They in quote were at the time, but 3 days later, as I pulled my truck up to the rusted cattle grate at the edge of the property, I found a woman standing there with a clipboard and a smile so sharp it could have cut glass. And she didn't in Oppos to even say hello. She just looked at me like I was a trespasser on my own soul and told me that the Pinecrest Homeowners Association had already legally claimed the Eastern Ridge for their new, in quote, Nature Serenity Circuit, end quote. I stood there, the dust from the gravel road still settling on my boots, looking at this woman, Brenda, as I later learned she was called, and I realized she wasn't an Oppos. T just some neighbor. She was the queen bee of a suburban hive that had slowly been creeping toward my uncle's land like a slow-moving lava flow of manicured lawns and white picket fences. She pointed a manicured finger toward a massive, ornate stone archway that had been built, literally built, 50 yards inside my property line, and beyond it was a paved walking path, benches, and even little solar-powered lampposts, all looking very expensive and very permanent. I told her as calmly as I could that there must be a mistake, that I had the deed right here in the truck, but she just chuckled this dry, condescending sound and told me that under the laws of this state, they had, in quote, openly and notoriously, in quote, improved the land for over 12 years. And since Silas never sued them, the land now belonged to the community through adverse possession. It was a classic power play, the kind of thing where they bet on you being too poor, too tired, or too intimidated to fight a group of 300 angry suburbanites who think their right to a morning jog outweighs your right to your family legacy. But what Brenda didn't in Oppos, Tino, was that I spent my days as a forensic land surveyor, a guy who literally makes a living finding the tiny, hidden mistakes in property lines that keep lawyers in business. So while she was talking about, in quote, community spirit, in quote, and in quote, the greater good, in quote, I was already looking at the way the drainage from their subdivision was illegally diverted into my uncle's creek. I told her I wasn't signing anything and that she had 48 hours to get her, in quote, Serenity Circuit, in quote, off my dirt, and the look she gave me was pure venom, a mask of politeness slipping to reveal a woman who was used to getting exactly what she wanted. She told me I was being, end quote, neighborly challenged, end quote, and that the association had a legal fund larger than my net worth. And as she walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement they'd stolen from me, she called out over her shoulder that the town meeting was Thursday and I was welcome to come see how much the town hated me. The next few days were a blur of deep dives into Silas's old filing cabinets. And man, let me tell you, that old man was a genius in his own quiet way, because he hadn't into Oppos. He'd been ignoring the HOA at all. He'd been baiting them. I found a shoebox filled with certified mail receipts, hundreds of them, all addressed to the Pinecrest HOA. And when I pulled the copies of the letters, I started laughing so hard I had to sit down on the floor. Every single year, like clockwork, Silas had sent a formal, in quote, notice of non-consent, end quote, explicitly stating that he was aware of their trespassing, that he denied them any right to the land, but that he was granting them a, end quote, revocable temporary license, end quote, to walk the path out of the goodness of his heart. In the world of adverse possession, that's a silver bullet, because you can in Oppos, claim your, end quote, stealing, end quote, land if the owner is technically, in quote, lending, in quote, it to you. It kills the, end quote, hostile, in quote, requirement of the law dead in its tracks. But Brenda hadn't in Oppos. T told the homeowners about those letters. She'd told them the land was theirs for the taking. And As I scrolled through the neighborhood Facebook group that night, I saw that I'd been turned into the local boogeyman. There were posts with hundreds of comments calling me a, in quote, greedy outsider, in quote, a, in quote, land hoarder, in quote, and even people suggesting they should picket my driveway, so I couldn't in oppos, to get out to go to work. The psychological pressure was intense, and for a second, I wondered if I should just take the lowball settlement offer Brenda's lawyer emailed me. A measly 50 grand for 300 acres of prime ridgeline. But then I remembered Silas's shaky handwriting. Don in oppos, T let in oppos, and move the stones. He wasn't in oppos, T talking about the boundary markers. He was talking about the truth. Thursday night arrived, and the community center was packed, smelling of damp raincoats and cheap coffee. And as I walked in, the room went dead silent, like a scene out of a Western where the outlaw walks into the saloon. Brenda was up on the stage, looking regal in a navy blazer, flanked by a board of men who looked like they all shared the same tailor and the same lack of a spine. She gave this soaring speech about the, in quote, sacred bond of the neighborhood, in quote, and how I was threatening to tear a hole in the heart of their community by closing the trail, and by the time she was done, people were literally standing up and shouting at me from the rows. One guy, a big fella in a golf shirt, stood up and yelled, in quote, how do you sleep at night knowing my kids won in oppos? Do you have a safe place to ride their bikes because of your ego? End quote. And the crowd went wild, clapping and whistling like they were at a gladiatorial match. I waited until the noise died down, and then I didn't in oppos. To go to the microphone, I just stood up in the back of the room and pulled out a portable projector I'd brought in my backpack. I aimed it at the big white wall behind Brenda and flicked it on, and the first thing that popped up wasn't oppos, a map. It was a scan of a check for $12,000 made out to, end quote, Caldwell Landscaping and Design, end quote, which just happened to be owned by Brenda's husband. The room got quiet real fast. I started clicking through the HOA's own public financial records that I'd spent 48 hours cross-referencing with the town's building permits, and I showed them that the, end quote, Nature Serenity Circuit, end quote, didn't in oppos, cost the $200,000 the HOA had been billed. It cost about $80,000, and the rest of that money, their dues, their hard-earned cash, had disappeared into a web of shell companies and, in quote, consulting fees, in quote, all linked back to the board members sitting on that stage. Brenda's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple, and she started screaming that I was out of order, that this was a private meeting, but the crowd wasn't in oppos, looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. I told them, end quote, I don in oppos. Care about your trail. I care about the fact that your leadership didn't in oppos. Just steal my land. They stole your money to build it. And the only reason they wanted my uncle's land so bad was because it's the only place the town would allow them to build a new drainage basin for the Phase 4 expansion, an expansion that Brenda's husband already has the contract for. End quote. It was a house of cards, and I just kicked the table. Then came the final blow, the one that Silas had set up 10 years ago. I pulled up the scan of the, end quote, revocable license, end quote, letter Silas had sent every year, and I showed the delivery signatures, Brenda's own signature, dated and timed, year after year. I said, end quote, she knew the land wasn't in oppos, the HOA in oppos. She knew it the whole time. She lied to you so she could use your dues to build a project that benefited her husband in oppos. Business, and she figured she'd just bully the, in oppos, old hermit in oppos, nephew in oppos, into silence so the fraud would never come to light. End quote. The explosion of noise that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't in oppos, directed at me. It was a literal riot of homeowners realizing they'd been played for fools by the woman they'd trusted to protect their property values. I walked out of that meeting while the board was still trying to scramble out the back door to avoid being cornered by a mob of angry taxpayers, and the air outside felt crisp and clean, like the world had just been washed. A week later, the entire board resigned. A special prosecutor was appointed to look into the, end quote, missing, end quote, funds, and I received a very different kind of letter from the interim HOA president, a humble, desperate plea for an easement. I didn't in oppos, to give it to them. Not at first. I made them tear down the stone archway and the lampposts, and I made them regrade the drainage so it didn't in oppos, flood my creek, And only after they'd spent 6 months and another 50 grand fixing the damage they'd done did I sit down and negotiate. I didn't end oppos. T asked for money. I asked for a permanent conservation easement that says the 1,500 acres can never be developed, never be subdivided, and will remain wild forever, even after I'm gone. I'll let them keep a small, unpaved walking path, but only on the condition that the HOA pays for a full-time forest ranger to patrol the entire ridge to keep it clean. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and it's why I'm telling you this. After the dust settled, I found one more folder in Silas's safe. It was a set of photos of Brenda, but they weren't into oppos. Recent. They were from the 80s, and she was standing right there on that ridge, next to Silas, and they were both smiling, looking like two people who had the whole world in front of them. There was no note, no explanation, just those photos. It made me realize that this whole war might not have been about land or money for her. Maybe it was about a woman who had been rejected 30 years ago, trying to pave over the memories of the only man who ever really knew her. Or maybe she was just greedy. I don't know. Now, the ridge is quiet again, the way Silas liked it. And every time I walk up there and see that oak sapling I planted where the stone arch used to be, I wonder if I was the hero of this story or just the final weapon in a grudge that lasted a lifetime. But I want to know what you think. Did I go too far by exposing their finances in front of the whole town? Or is that just the price you pay for trying to steal a man in oppos? As legacy? Would you have taken the $50,000 and walked away, or would you have held the line like Silas asked? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure out if I did the right thing or if I just finished a fight that should have died with my uncle. Drop a comment, hit like if you think Brenda got what she deserved, and I'll see you in the next one.